She was kneeling on the cold stone floor, her hands rough from cleaning. He was looking down at her from his high leather chair and let out a loud, mean laugh. He said she was not smart. He made fun of her right there in front of a whole room full of powerful people. That man had no clue that the quiet woman holding the cleaning stick, the one he treated like she was nothing, had a high degree from one of the world's best schools. He certainly did not know that she was about to take everything he owned and put his entire life on fire. This is the true story of a very wealthy man who treated the wrong person badly. It cost him his entire business empire and his reputation. Stay here, because the way she paid him back is something people will talk about forever. This story will make you look at everyone you meet completely differently. Before we start, write your name and where in the world you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever walked past someone who cleans floors or serves food and barely saw them? Have you ever quickly judged someone based only on the job they do? This story is about a powerful man who made that exact mistake, and it cost him everything he had. This happened in London, inside one of those extremely expensive private clubs where only the richest and most important people meet up. You know the kind of place. The floors are made of shiny, expensive stone. Huge glass lights hang from the ceiling, and the comfortable leather chairs probably cost more than most people's cars. It was the kind of place where you need special connections just to walk in the front door. Her name was Sophie Bennett. She was 26 years old. She was very quiet, with gentle eyes hidden behind simple, plain glasses. Every evening, she would arrive at the Wellington Club wearing her work clothes, a simple gray dress with the club's small picture stitched on the pocket. She moved silently, cleaning the hard floors, taking out the trash, and wiping down all the tables. After the rich members finished their meetings, to everyone in that club, she was simply invisible. Just another cleaning woman, someone to completely ignore. But Sophie Bennett was so much more than anyone imagined. On this specific night, the club was hosting a huge, special dinner. The main guest everyone was watching was Thomas Ashford, a man 42 years old. Thomas was a builder who had made billions of dollars buying up land all across London. He was the type of man who showed off his money everywhere he went. He wore high-priced watches, suits from famous designers, and shoes so shiny you could see a reflection in the leather. He owned almost half the tall buildings in the center of London, and he made sure that everyone in the world knew exactly how rich he was. Thomas sat right in the center table with his business partners. He was laughing very loud, drinking a glass of dark red wine that cost more for that one bottle than Sophie earned in a whole month. His voice carried across the entire room as he told long stories about his latest deals, about the companies he had completely crushed, and about the families he had forced out of their homes just so he could build luxury apartments. Sophie was cleaning close by. She kept her head down, moving quietly, like a shadow. She was wiping off a table that the waiters had already cleared. Then Thomas noticed her. "You," he suddenly yelled, snapping his fingers sharply toward her. "Come over here right now." Sophie slowly looked up. Her heart started to beat very fast, thumping hard in her chest, but she walked over to him very calmly. "Yes, sir?" she asked clearly. Thomas leaned way back in his expensive chair. A cruel, mean smile spread slowly across his face. He had been drinking for a few hours, and he was bored with his friend's talk. He wanted entertainment. "Tell me this," he began. Thomas Ashford stared at the young cleaner holding the napkin, his face frozen in a rictus of shock and rage. The calculated £8 million hole she had just uncovered felt like a physical blow to his enormous ego. He opened his mouth to shout, but Sophie was already moving. She placed the used napkin neatly back on the table, her eyes, usually downcast, meeting his in a cold, hard glare. She did not wait for dismissal. The room held its collective breath, witnessing a silent shift in power. Sophie simply nodded once, a gesture of finality, turned her back on the stunned billionaire, and walked toward the staff exit, the heavy velvet curtains silencing her quick, steady retreat. Outside the gilded cage of the Wellington Club, the harsh London night felt cold and real. The adrenaline that had spiked during the confrontation now burned into pure, focused anger. Thomas Ashford had tried to humiliate her, not just because she was a cleaner, but because he believed mathematics belonged only to men in tailored suits, not to a 26-year-old former Cambridge student scrubbing his floors. More importantly, he had brought up the name of her father's property, Hartley Tower, the building whose loss had shattered Richard Bennett's life and led to his death from stress. The invisible woman had been seen, and she would not be invisible again. Sophie took the Northern Line back to her small, cramped flat in East London. The journey was long, taking 45 minutes, a stark reminder of the massive geographical and social gap between her world and Thomas Ashford's. As the train rattled through the dark tunnels, she gripped the handle of her cleaning bucket, visualizing the layout of Thomas's financial empire. She knew the general shape of his arrogance, and arrogance, she remembered from her studies in probability, always increased risk exponentially. The flat was tiny, just one room with a small kitchenette wedged into a corner. It was quiet, tidy, and smelled faintly of disinfectant and old books. She stripped off the heavy, uncomfortable blue uniform and washed her face with cold water, the action calming the residual tremor of fury. Now it was time for calculation. She sat at her small, rickety desk, pulling her battered laptop toward her. This was the true engine of her power, hidden beneath her cleaning supplies. She bypassed the slow public internet connection and, using a secure virtual private network, she accessed the deep academic databases she still had access to from her days at Cambridge University. Her fingers, usually calloused from scrubbing floors, danced quickly across the keyboard, entering complex access codes she had designed herself years ago. The target was the Ashford Property Group, or APG. Sophie started her forensic dive immediately. She needed to look beyond the glittering annual reports and the glossy, magazine-ready projects. She went straight for the raw data. The bond issuances, the debt-to-equity ratios, the specific covenants on their major loans, and the legal structures of their subsidiary holdings. She was looking for a fault line, a single, critical point of failure that Thomas Ashford, blinded by his own sense of absolute success, had overlooked. The first hour yielded a pattern of aggressive, almost reckless expansion. APG wasn't merely ambitious. It was over-leveraged. They operated on razor-thin margins, prioritizing acquisition and growth velocity over financial security. If the market hiccuped, Thomas would cough up blood. "The leverage is astounding," she muttered to herself, staring at the screen. The debt ratio was high, dangerously so. She saw that Thomas had mortgaged existing successful properties, like the prestigious Wellington Club's office space, to fund future projects. He was playing a massive game of financial chicken, relying entirely on continuous, rapid success. Then she found the centerpiece of his current strategy, the Riverside Plaza development. The project was gargantuan, a proposed luxury tower and retail hub that Thomas had boasted about everywhere. The total projected cost flashed on her screen, £300 million. The sheer scale was terrifying, but Sophie, the mathematician, saw the beauty in the numbers. This was not diversification, it was dependency. She traced the flow of capital and the financing terms. All of APG's short-term debts were stacked up, due to mature in the next 12 months. If the Riverside Plaza project launched successfully, the massive projected profits would cover everything. If the project stalled or, worse, failed to get off the ground, the dominoes would fall instantly. The banks would call in their loans, and the entire structure would collapse into immediate bankruptcy. The hinge point, Sophie realized, lay not in the financial market, but in bureaucratic procedure. Before Thomas could secure the final, massive tranche of financing, the hundreds of millions necessary to start digging, he needed one key approval: the local council's planning permission vote, scheduled for next month, in less than 30 days. "He needs that yes vote," she whispered, her voice tight. "It's the only thing keeping the whole house of cards standing." She focused her screen on the planning application documents. The level of detail was enormous. Thousands of pages of environmental impact assessments, community consultations, and proposed job creation figures. It was precisely the kind of tedious, unglamorous documentation that a ruthless man like Thomas Ashford would delegate and barely glance at, assuming his power would carry the day. This was where she had the advantage. Thomas bought influence. Sophie worked with facts. She spent the next few hours meticulously cross-referencing the publicly filed financial data with the economic projections submitted to the council. She confirmed the devastating truth. The failure of the Riverside Plaza vote would trigger a liquidity crisis so severe that APG would be ruined within a week. Humiliation was too soft a punishment for a man who had murdered her father through corporate theft. She wanted total destruction. Sophie closed her laptop, the screen going dark, reflecting her own determined image back at her. Her heart hammered not with fear, but with a cold sense of purpose. Her father had been destroyed by Thomas Ashford's greed and superior connections. But Thomas had fatally underestimated the enemy he had created. He had mistaken a brilliant mind for a menial labor. The countdown had started. In less than 30 days, the local council would decide the fate of £300 million and the fate of the Ashford property group. Sophie Bennett, the cleaning lady, now knew exactly where to strike. She would ensure the vote failed. She stood up, stretching her stiff muscles. The analysis was complete. Now the operational phase of the war began. The analysis was complete. Now the operational phase of the war began. Sophie returned to the opulent world of the Wellington Club 2 nights later, dressed again in the anonymous charcoal uniform of the cleaning crew. She moved with practiced invisibility, pushing a heavy steel trolley laden with detergents and fresh linens. Tonight, she was not polishing brass or emptying waste bins. Tonight, she was hunting. She needed a direct, actionable piece of evidence, something that transcended mathematical flaw and proved criminal intent. She knew Thomas Ashford was arrogant enough to talk business in public, especially after several glasses of expensive scotch, convinced that no one who mattered was listening. She positioned herself near the secluded study annex, a small, walnut-paneled room reserved for the club's most private dealings. She began a slow, meticulous dusting of the display cabinets just outside the room, the faint scent of lemon polish masking her presence. The deep burgundy velvet curtain covering the annex door was drawn, but Sophie could hear the low rumble of voices. She recognized the primary voice instantly, Thomas Ashford, loud and dismissive. The other voice was weaker, laced with anxiety. Sophie strained her ears, calibrating the pace of her dusting strokes to the rhythm of their conversation. She caught fragments. Riverside. The margin is thin. We need a commitment. Thomas's voice cut through the muffled fear. Jeffrey, let's be clear. This isn't a discussion. The vote is next week. You deliver the majority. I deliver the final transfer. £50,000. That is the agreement we made 4 weeks ago. Sophie froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drum. Jeffrey Winters, the council member whose single vote could swing the Riverside Plaza approval, was taking a bribe. This wasn't just bad business. This was explicit corruption. Winters' voice sounded thin. Thomas, The press is circling. If this gets out, I lose everything. Maybe jail time. Can we perhaps structure the payment differently? Say, a consultancy fee paid over 6 months? Thomas laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound that echoed the room's entitlement. Don't insult my intelligence, Jeffrey. You want my money, you do the job. The entire Ashford Property Group hinges on this project, and if you fail, I fail. And if I fail, I guarantee you, £50,000 will be the least of your worries. The money is ready. Delivered the day after the vote is finalized, provided the outcome is yes. Sophie knew this was the moment. She slid her small, inexpensive phone out of her apron pocket, its screen dim. Her fingers, trained to calculate complex equations, were now tasked with the simple, dangerous operation of recording. She activated the voice memo application and gently placed the phone inside a folded white linen napkin, which she then placed on the rim of her cleaning trolley, right next to the wall separating her from the two men. It was a risky move. If either of them stepped out, the small, pulsing red light on the screen would expose her entire plan. She resumed polishing a heavy silver trophy, her movements deliberately slow and smooth, masking the frantic speed of her pulse. For the next 3 minutes, she could hear the crackle of Thomas Ashford lighting a cigar and the low, defeated sigh of Jeffrey Winters accepting his terms. Good. Now drink your scotch, Jeffrey. You deserve it. And remember who keeps you solvent. A chair scraped back. Sophie snatched her phone back into her pocket just as the burgundy velvet curtain was swept aside. Thomas Ashford emerged, radiating expensive cologne and alcohol, completely unaware of the device that had just captured his criminal intent. He barely glanced at the cleaner bent over the trophy before disappearing down the hallway. Sophie did not move until she heard the distant click of the club's large front doors closing. She was shaking, but not from fear, from the intense surge of adrenaline. She had the proof. Back in her cramped East London flat, the recording played back, harsh and grainy. The voices were clear enough, but overlaid with the clatter of ice and the heavy static of the room's air conditioning. A jury might find it inconclusive. Thomas Ashford's lawyers would certainly frame it as manipulated or taken out of context. She needed more than an audio file. She needed amplification, credibility, and reach. She needed a public stage for the truth. She immediately thought of the one force capable of standing up to Thomas Ashford's media empire, a journalist hungry for a kill shot. Sophie pulled up her laptop and typed in Temps Gazette Investigative Reporter London Property Fraud. The result at the top of the list was Oliver Price. His profile picture showed a man with tired eyes and a fierce expression, known for exposing high-level corruption that other papers avoided. She found his direct contact number. It was well past 11 o'clock at night. She hesitated, looking at the two small, cheap mugs on her kitchen table, a ghostly reminder of the simple life she once shared with her father. Everything was on this single call. She pressed the dial button. It rang 7 times before a rough, weary voice answered. Price. Mr. Price, my name is Sophie Bennett. I have irrefutable proof of criminal corruption directly implicating Thomas Ashford and a sitting council member regarding the Riverside Plaza development vote. Sophie spoke quickly, maintaining a low, controlled tone, injecting absolute certainty into every word. There was a long silence on the line, punctuated by the rustle of paper. I get 20 calls like this a week, Ms. Bennett. Usually, it's disgruntled ex-employees with a grudge. Ashford's legal team is bulletproof. Why should I waste my time? Because this is not a grudge, Mr. Price, Sophie countered, her voice dropping slightly, becoming intensely serious. This is a recorded bribe payment for £50,000, confirmed by Thomas Ashford himself, to ensure the council grants planning permission. I know exactly when the council vote is scheduled, and I know exactly where Mr. Ashford will be hosting his final public presentation for investors and press. She paused, letting the information sink in, the specific details validating her claim. I need you to be there, Mr. Price. You and every camera you can bring. I will provide you with the full audio, plus detailed forensic evidence of fraud, on the day of the presentation itself. Everything is timed for maximum exposure. I am not looking for money or recognition. I am looking for justice. Oliver Price cleared his throat. The weariness in his voice was replaced by a sharp, professional intensity. The presentation date. Give it to me. In precisely 10 days, Sophie stated. It will be held at the Wellington Club Grand Ballroom. I will contact you 24 hours before the event with precise instructions. Until then, you do not publish, you do not tip off the police, and you do not contact anyone linked to the Ashford Group. If you do, the evidence disappears and the story dies. Price let out a soft whistle. You've done your homework. All right, Ms. Bennett. You have my word. I will be there, and I will bring the cameras. Just make sure your evidence is as ironclad as you say. It will be, Sophie promised, her eyes fixed on the dark, reflective screen of her laptop. When I am finished, Thomas Ashford will have nothing left but contempt for the one thing he overlooked, the cleaner. She hung up the phone. The ally was secured. The stage was set. Now, she had 10 days to build the rest of the bomb. The ally was secured. The stage was set. Now, she had 10 days to build the rest of the bomb. Sophie's small flat, usually illuminated only by the weak glow of streetlights filtering through cheap blinds, was now constantly bathed in the harsh, blue-white light of her 2 large monitors. The air grew stale, heavy with the scent of microwaved soup and cold coffee. The distinction between day and night blurred. Sleep became a 2-hour necessity, a logistical pause in the pursuit of justice. For 10 days, Sophie Bennett ceased to be a cleaner or a grieving daughter. She became a forensic mathematician, driven by a furious, cold precision. She began by organizing the mountains of data she had downloaded from the Ashford Property Group's public submissions, everything from environmental impact studies and economic projections to legal contracts and municipal planning codes. There were literally thousands of pages of dense text, purposefully structured to confuse or bore anyone lacking the incentive to dig deep. But Sophie had the motivation, and she possessed the key, her analytical training. She didn't read the documents. She processed them, running algorithms to cross-reference data points, looking for correlations that Thomas Ashford's compliance teams had assumed no one would ever connect. Her fingers danced over the keyboard, the steady rhythm a counterpoint to the silence of her concentration. She started with the economic claims. Thomas Ashford's presentation, the very one she intended to disrupt, promised to be a triumph of local economic stimulus. It claimed the Riverside Plaza development would create thousands of permanent local jobs, transforming the neighborhood. Sophie found the first fatal flaw buried deep within the infrastructure appendix, specifically in the detailed 5-year maintenance and operational budget for the new plaza. She leaned back, rubbing her tired eyes, then zoomed in on a specific spreadsheet cell. They promised 500 permanent jobs, she murmured aloud, the sound scratching the stillness of the room. She looked at the cost per employee projection listed in the budget, wages, benefits, equipment allotment. But the budget allocation only covers salaries for 150 staff members across all departments. The discrepancy was stark. 350 phantom jobs invented purely to secure the council's enthusiastic endorsement. It was not merely an exaggeration. It was a clear case of fraudulent misrepresentation designed to deceive public officials. Thomas had calculated that the sheer complexity of the budget spreadsheet would deter any non-specialist from spotting the missing salaries. He was right until now. Sophie highlighted the two conflicting figures in bright red on her screen. Lie number 1, she whispered, a grim satisfaction settling in her stomach. Next, she turned her attention to the physical land itself. The Riverside Plaza project was massive, requiring the full annexation of a significant stretch of waterfront. Sophie pulled up the detailed topographical survey map submitted by APG and layered it over decades-old municipal zoning maps, which she had accessed using her old university credentials. A highly illegal maneuver that felt necessary, like a surgical strike. She noticed a minute inconsistency in the lower quadrant of the construction site. Thomas's maps labeled it simply wasteland suitable for foundational restructuring. Sophie's historical maps revealed a very different truth. A faint boundary line, dating back to the 1980s, designated that precise area as a protected freshwater wetland, critical habitat for local bird species. The difference in legal designation was everything. Developing on a protected wetland was not just an environmental fine. It was a planning violation that could immediately halt the entire project, incurring massive contractual penalties. Thomas, or someone under his direction, had simply altered the digital zoning map submitted to the council, betting that the council member, Jeffrey Winters, already paid off, would never bother to check the physical paper archives or the independent environmental report. Sophie cross-referenced the coordinates of the protected zone with the current development blueprint. The planned underground parking structure went directly through the designated wetland. This was not negligence. This was a deliberate, criminal act of environmental destruction to save money on foundational support. She printed the two conflicting maps side by side. The contrast was undeniable, visible even to the untrained eye. She pinned them to the corkboard next to her desk, a growing gallery of Thomas Ashford's corruption. The final pillar of Thomas's fraud was the most critical for his investors, the projected returns. The entire £300 million project was funded by a mixture of bank loans and direct investment, all relying on the promise of immense profits from the sale of luxury apartments. Sophie downloaded every public sales prospectus for comparable high-end properties within a 3-mile radius of the Riverside Plaza site. She spent an entire night running statistical regression analyses, factoring in current market saturation, local income indices, and predicted economic growth. The result was stunning in its audacity. Thomas Ashford was projecting the average sales price of his penthouse units at £3 million. Sophie looked at her own calculated, conservative market value based on current trends. The true market value is closer to £1,700,000, she calculated, pressing the figures onto the screen. The difference, £1,300,000 per unit, was pure fiction, designed solely to inflate the company's apparent value and secure over-leveraged financing from gullible banks and hopeful investors. If the apartments sold at the real market price, APG would not just fail to make a profit. They would immediately default on several high-interest loans, creating a financial sinkhole. Thomas was not just building a property. He was running a massive Ponzi scheme disguised as luxury development. "This isn't business," Sophie stated, stretching her neck, hearing the vertebrae click painfully after hours hunched over. "This is a house of cards built on debt and contempt." The discoveries fueled her, overriding the physical exhaustion. She knew finding the evidence wasn't enough. She had to transform complex legal and mathematical proof into something instantly understandable, something that would resonate with journalists and shock investors in the space of 3 minutes. She began the critical process of simplification. She had secured the raw materials, the facts, and now she forged the weapon. She chose a clean, stark presentation template. No fancy graphics, no corporate logos. Just black text on a white background, punctuated by simple, easily digestible charts. For the job fraud, the slide read, Claimed jobs, 500. Budgeted jobs, 150. Difference, 350 lies. A simple bar graph visualized the financial gap. For the wetland violation, the slide showed the two conflicting maps, side by side, clearly highlighting the illegally paved area next to the exact regulatory code Thomas had violated. Below it, the text, Riverside Plaza is built on protected land. Stop order mandatory. For the financial fraud, the final, most damning slide showed two intersecting lines, APG projected sale price, fantasy, versus actual market value, reality. The space between the lines was labeled investor risk, total default. She spent an entire day reviewing the recordings she had made of Thomas Ashford and Jeffrey Winters discussing the bribe. She transcribed the key snippets, making sure the audio was clear enough to be understood even in a large, noisy room. The plan was to play only the most damning 30 seconds of that conversation, just enough time for the sound to sink in, for the cameras to capture the moment of Thomas's realization, and for the entire room to dissolve into panic. By the evening of the 9th day, the presentation was flawless, concise, and utterly devastating. It was organized into 5 simple acts of exposure: economic deception, environmental criminality, financial fraud, legal violation, and finally, the undeniable proof of bribery. Sophie printed 2 copies of every single piece of supporting documentation: the true budget sheet, the authentic zoning map, the market comparisons, binding them neatly. 1 set for Oliver Price, the journalist, and 1 set for her to hold in the event Thomas tried to physically destroy her evidence. She changed out of her sweatpants and into the crisp, clean uniform of the Wellington Club. She looked at her reflection. The eyes were tired, but the gaze was fierce. She placed the USB drive containing the full presentation and the recording into the pocket of her uniform blouse, right over her heart. It was time to go to work, not as a cleaner, but as the executioner of Thomas Ashford's career. The feeling in her chest was not anxiety or fear, but a cold, heavy sense of anticipation. She remembered her father, Richard Bennett, watching his life's work, Hartley Tower, be stolen by Thomas's predatory deals, the stress literally taking his life. This was not revenge. This was correcting an imbalance, using the language Thomas understood best: mathematical inevitability. She picked up her bag. The invisible woman was ready to step into the light. The Wellington Club's grand ballroom smelled of polished mahogany, expensive champagne, and the nervous anticipation of vast wealth. Crystal chandeliers cast a dazzling, blinding light over the sea of dark suits and glittering gowns. The air conditioning was fighting a losing battle against the heat generated by hundreds of powerful bodies crammed together to witness the presentation of the Riverside Plaza project. At the front of the room, on a stage flanked by massive screens displaying shimmering, aspirational renderings of the planned complex, stood Thomas Ashford. He was exactly where he loved to be, center stage, basking in adoration. He smiled, a wide, self-satisfied grin that didn't quite reach his calculating eyes, holding a glass of amber liquid. "Ladies and gentlemen," Thomas boomed into the microphone, his voice easily filling the cavernous space. "Today, we aren't just discussing a building. We are discussing the future of this city. We are talking about the Riverside Plaza." He paused for dramatic effect. A vision valued at over £300 million. The investors applauded eagerly. Oliver Price, the investigative journalist, sat hunched among the press, his recorder already running, though he looked skeptical. He kept glancing toward the service entrance, waiting for the source of the anonymous tip that had brought him here. Sophie, dressed in the club's standard dark gray trousers and white polo shirt, moved slowly from the back service door, blending into the shadows cast by the large potted palms. She carried a small tray, pretending to clear imaginary discarded glasses, inching her way toward the center aisle. No one noticed her. Cleaners were, by design, invisible. Thomas, now fully into his sales pitch, was gesturing wildly at the screens, detailing the supposed environmental benefits and the promise of 5,000 new local jobs. This was the moment. Sophie reached the main aisle, approximately halfway down the room. She stopped, placed the empty tray on a nearby side table with a faint click, and then stepped out of the shadows and into the blinding light of the stage spotlights. She stood still for a moment, letting the room register the sudden intrusion. Thomas Ashford, mid-sentence, froze. He looked down the aisle and his smile instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer annoyance, like spotting a stain on a perfect white rug. "I apologize," Thomas said smoothly, though his voice was tight. "It seems we have a member of the service staff who has lost her way. Could someone please—" "I haven't lost my way, Mr. Ashford," Sophie interrupted, her voice clear, amplified only by the sudden, dead silence of the room. Every head pivoted toward her. Thomas frowned. Recognizing her face from the night, she solved his math problem. His annoyance sharpened into cruel amusement. He decided to play to the crowd.
"Ah, yes.
The mathematician cleaner," Thomas chuckled. "Looking for another napkin calculation? I'm terribly busy right now, sweetheart. If you'd like to discuss the quadratic formula, perhaps you could email my secretary after you finish polishing the silver." A few of the investors laughed uncomfortably. Thomas assumed this brief public humiliation would send her running. "I'm not here to clean, Mr. Ashford," Sophie stated, maintaining eye contact. She pulled a small remote control from her pocket. "I'm here to audit." Before anyone could react, Sophie pointed the remote at the massive screen behind Thomas. With a sharp electronic flash, the polished renderings of Riverside Plaza disappeared, replaced by a stark, black-and-white chart titled, "Projected versus Actual Job Impact, Riverside Plaza." Gasps ripple through the room. Oliver Price, recognizing the cue, raised his professional camera and began filming the young woman in the uniform. Thomas, furious, took a step toward the edge of the stage. "What in God's name are you doing?" "Security." "I am showing your investors the truth," Sophie said, ignoring his shouts. She spoke quickly, with the precision of a lecturer delivering undeniable facts. "You promised 5,000 jobs, Thomas. Your preliminary labor model, the one you tried to bury in footnote 72 of the Appendix G, shows that to facilitate this development, you must tear down 3 established warehouses employing 5,350 people. Your actual net job impact is a loss of 350 full-time positions." She clicked the remote. The screen flashed to a new document, a complex ledger displaying red deficit numbers. "And speaking of truth," Sophie continued, her voice gaining strength, "let's examine the economics. You've projected unit sales at an average of £1.2 million per flat. This projection hinges on a major transport infrastructure upgrade that, as documented by the City Planning Commission," she pointed to the screen where the relevant legal code was highlighted in stark yellow, "was rejected last month due to budget constraints." "This is slander. This is baseless data from a cleaning lady," Thomas roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He tried to signal his technicians to cut the feed, but they were paralyzed, fearing the legal implications of touching evidence in front of a dozen journalists. Sophie advanced 2 steps closer, dominating the aisle. "Let's keep going, Thomas. The legal constraints." She clicked the remote again. Now the screen showed satellite imagery, clearly marking a specific patch of green area near the riverbank, overlaid with red zoning lines. "You designated the northwest quadrant of the development as recreational green space to secure environmental approval. In reality, Mr. Ashford, you plan to build 3,000 underground parking spaces on top of a protected wetland area designated in the year 2004. The environmental penalty alone, upon discovery, is calculated at over £8 million, and the development will be legally halted immediately. The murmurs in the room turned into shouts. Investors were on their feet, frantically dialing their lawyers and portfolio managers. The sheer density and simplicity of Sophie's presentation, complex data distilled into irrefutable visual points, was devastating. You have destroyed the economics, the legal framework, and the environmental integrity of this project, Sophie declared. She paused, letting the chaos boil for a moment. Thomas was gripping the podium, breathing heavily, trying desperately to regain control of his audience. And now, Sophie said, her voice dropping to a low, cold register, let's discuss the ethics. How you guaranteed that this fatally flawed plan would pass the council vote. She clicked the remote one last time. The screen turned completely black. A harsh, static-laced audio recording began to play over the club's powerful sound system. The voices were muffled but instantly recognizable. Thomas Ashford's arrogant drawl and Councilman Jeffrey Winter's slick, low tone. The vote is next week. I need the guaranteed yes, Jeffrey. It's secured, Thomas. We handle the paperwork. But the final tranche, the £100,000, needs to be discreetly delivered tonight, separate from the rest.
Done.
Consider it handled. Just make sure that planning approval sails through without a hitch. This project is too big to fail. The sound of the recording sliced through the ballroom like broken glass. The room erupted into instantaneous pandemonium. Investors screamed, rushing for the exits or converging on Thomas, demanding answers. Flashbulbs popped blindingly as Oliver Price and the other journalists captured Thomas Ashford's face, frozen in a mask of total horror and realization. Thomas lunged forward, stumbling over the podium, trying to snatch the remote from Sophie. Security finally reacted, surging forward. But Sophie had already done her damage. She stepped back, out of Thomas's desperate reach, the small microphone on her uniform amplifying her final, shattering words. "You are a criminal, Thomas Ashford," she stated, ignoring the frantic security guards now surrounding her. She looked directly at Thomas, whose eyes, wide with panic, finally registered her as more than an annoyance. "You won't get away with this."
Who the hell are you?
Thomas screamed, his voice cracking, the polished veneer finally shattered. Sophie straightened her shoulders, her gaze piercing. The simple name she spoke was not just an identity, it was a ghost entering the room. "My name is Dr. Sophie Bennett," she said clearly. "I am the daughter of Richard Bennett. Hartley Tower was his life's work, and you stole it. You killed him with your greed and your stress, just so you could acquire the land." Her voice trembled slightly, the only sign of the years of grief and anger she carried. "You always look down on people, Thomas. You underestimated my father, and you certainly underestimated the cleaner. I exposed you because you murdered him. And now, I am here to ensure that your own life's work, the Riverside Plaza, is nothing but dust." The silence that followed Sophie's final, damning words lasted only a second. Then, a roar exploded in the grand room of the Wellington Club. Thomas Ashford, his face turning a deep, dangerous crimson, lunged forward. "Security, get this lunatic out of here."
Now.
But the security guards were already overwhelmed by the sudden, intense surge of journalists. Camera flashes erupted like continuous lightning, momentarily blinding the attendees. Investors, their faces etched with horror, stood up, knocking over crystal glasses and expensive chairs. The sound of crashing glass mingled with the frantic shouts of lawyers trying to cover their clients. Oliver Price, the investigative journalist, moved with ruthless efficiency. He shoved his microphone toward the frantic Ashford and yelled, "Mr. Ashford, did you attempt to bribe Councilmember Winters for the Riverside Plaza vote? We have the recording." Ashford was still screaming at Sophie, pointing a trembling finger at her. "I don't know who you are. You're just a disgruntled employee. A thief. A liar." Sophie stood her ground, the simple black cleaning uniform now looking less like a disguise and more like a uniform of war. She looked Thomas Ashford directly in the eye, maintaining a stillness that was utterly unnerving amidst the hurricane she had unleashed. "The evidence is filed," Sophie stated calmly, addressing the multitude of cameras flashing around her. "The full documentation showing the fraudulent projections, the environmental destruction, and the financial exposure for every single investor here is now being distributed to the relevant authorities." A loud, piercing alarm began to sound. Not an evacuation alarm, but the harsh, digital warning from someone's stock trading application. It was the sound of money fleeing. "Oliver," Sophie said, nodding toward the journalist, "I believe you have work to do." Oliver Price didn't need telling twice. Clutching the documents Sophie had handed him moments before, he sprinted toward the door, pushing past stunned businessmen and police officers who were just beginning to filter into the room, alerted by the club staff. Sophie allowed the Wellington Club security to escort her out, but they didn't treat her like a criminal. They treated her like a radioactive object, something dangerous that needed to be contained quickly before it caused further contamination. As she was ushered into the cool London night, she could still hear the furious clamor inside the club. Her face, framed by the harsh glare of a street lamp, was calm. The storm hit the financial district not hours later, but minutes later. By the time Sophie arrived back at her small, quiet flat in East London, the digital world was melting down. The initial shaky video of the confrontation, titled "Billionaire Ripped Apart by Cleaner," had already hit millions of views globally. The key moment, Sophie playing the recorded conversation where Thomas Ashford promised Jeffrey Winters £500,000 in offshore funds, was looping relentlessly on every news channel. The headlines were immediate, brutal, and simple, fulfilling Sophie's mandate of absolute public humiliation. Cleaner uncovers £300 million fraud. Ashford exposed. Bribery recording rocks London development. The truth in the dustpan. How arrogance crushed a billionaire. Oliver Price's exclusive investigation for the Thames Gazette was published online within an hour, a monumental piece of investigative journalism backed by the meticulously organized, irrefutable data Sophie had supplied. Price hadn't just reported on the bribery. He had used Sophie's analysis to show how Ashford Property Group, APG, was fundamentally hollow. The emperor had no clothes, Price wrote in the opening paragraph. APG was not a thriving empire. It was a shell company held together by the thread of the Riverside Plaza project. If that project fails, the entire house of cards collapses, potentially costing investors over £100 million. The market reacted with violence. At 9 o'clock the following morning, the London Stock Exchange opened, and APG stock collapsed instantly. The share price plummeted 90% in the first 30 minutes of trading. It went from a respectable 150 pence per share to less than 8 pence. Trading was immediately halted, a desperate measure to stop the total hemorrhage. Banks, viewing the damning evidence of corruption and the massive financial exposure, immediately froze all credit lines extended to Thomas Ashford and his various holding companies. The river of money that had sustained APG for years dried up overnight. The fallout was immediate and concrete. The local council, facing massive public pressure and legal mandates, announced the immediate postponement of the Riverside Plaza planning permission vote. The development was, for all intents and purposes, dead. Construction permits were rescinded, and the enormous machinery Ashford had prepared to move onto the contested wetland site was forced to stop. Thomas Ashford's empire was not crumbling slowly, it was atomizing. 3 days later, the legal net tightened. The Metropolitan Police Commercial Crime Unit had been working nonstop since the public presentation. Their first target was the weak link, the man who had the least to lose and the most reason to cooperate, Jeffrey Winters, the council member. Winters was apprehended quietly early Thursday morning outside his modest home in Surrey. He was terrified, his political career shattered, and his personal assets already being scrutinized. When faced with the recording of his voice and the threat of a long prison sentence, Winters implicated Thomas Ashford within hours. He detailed the payment schedule, the coded messages, and the offshore accounts designed to hide the £500,000. With Winters' testimony secured, the police moved on the head of the serpent. It was late Friday afternoon when 2 unmarked black sedans pulled up outside Thomas Ashford's gleaming 3-story penthouse in Kensington. The location symbolized everything Thomas had been: ostentatious wealth, exclusive views, and untouchable security. Inside the penthouse, Thomas was far from the roaring titan who had dominated the Wellington Club. He sat in his immense living room, surrounded by silent television screens displaying looping footage of the confrontation and screaming legal warnings. His tailored suit was wrinkled, his normally slicked-back hair was messy, and he was clutching an empty glass, the remnants of a very expensive brandy drying on the crystal. He looked less like a master of the universe and more like a ruined child. He had spent the last 72 hours on the phone with his lawyers, his bankers, and his public relations team, but all the expensive voices had the same message. The damage was too complete, the evidence too clean. The cleaner had scrubbed his life away. A loud, insistent buzzing echoed through the apartment. Thomas didn't move. He knew who it was. The door to the penthouse eventually slid open, defeated by a police warrant and the building manager's reluctant compliance. 2 detectives from the Commercial Crime Unit, Detective Inspector Davies and Detective Sergeant Kahn, stepped into the cavernous, silent room. They were in plain clothes but carried the weight of the law with them. Davies looked around at the priceless art and the panoramic view of London that Thomas had once owned. He saw Thomas slumped on a sofa the size of a small car. "Mr. Thomas Ashford?" Davies asked, his voice entirely devoid of emotion. Thomas lifted his head slowly. His eyes were bloodshot and confused. "You can't be serious. This is a misunderstanding. I am one of the largest employers in this city. You can't come in here without an appointment." Detective Kahn took a small, black notebook from his jacket pocket. "We have a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Ashford. Charges include conspiracy to commit fraud, corporate malfeasance, and bribery of a public official, pursuant to the testimony of Mr. Jeffrey Winters." Thomas tried to laugh, a dry, rasping sound. "Winters? That idiot? He's trying to save his own skin. I can pay any bond. I can have this sorted out by morning. Call my attorney, Mr. Thompson." Davies shook his head slightly. "We have already been in contact with your legal representation, sir. They advise you remain silent." Thomas finally stood up, his body trembling with the realization that this was not a business dispute that could be settled with a signature and a few £1,000,000. This was real. This was the law. "You don't understand," Thomas pleaded, his powerful voice now cracking. "That woman, the cleaner, she engineered this. She ruined me out of revenge." "We understand that the evidence presented is extensive, Mr. Ashford," Kahn said, taking out a pair of standard-issue steel handcuffs. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." The moment the cold metal clicked around his wrists, Thomas Ashford stopped struggling and stopped speaking. The shame, humiliation, and terror flooded him, washing away the arrogance he had cultivated for decades. He was led out of his massive, empty home. As the detectives walked him past the concierge desk and out toward the waiting sedan, Thomas saw his face reflected in the dark glass of the building's lobby, a face that was once synonymous with power, now reduced to a headline, "Prisoner." He was placed into the back of the car, his head bowed, the weight of his ruined empire settling heavily upon him. The sedan pulled away into the traffic, taking the former billionaire away from his exclusive neighborhood and toward the sterile, hard reality of the police station holding cells. The Invisible Woman had completed the first phase of her equation, total corporate destruction achieved. The news cycle eventually moved on from the spectacular collapse of Thomas Ashford, but the ripples of his downfall continued to spread. For Sophie, the silence in her small flat was finally a true silence, not the tense quiet before the storm. The cameras were gone from the street, and the heavy burden of her single, consuming goal had been lifted. 2 days after Ashford's arrest, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number with a familiar prefix, Cambridge. The caller was Professor Alastair Finch, the Dean of Mathematics.
Dr.
Bennett, the dean said, his voice clipped and serious. "I apologize for the informality of this call, but I suspect you are rather busy. I followed the story, of course. Your application of asymmetrical game theory to real-world corporate corruption was, shall we say, unprecedented." Sophie leaned against the wall, tired but alert. "I was applying common sense to criminal negligence, Professor." "Perhaps," he conceded. "But the analytical rigor was extraordinary. The university's Senate has met. They are offering you an immediate, full scholarship to return and complete your doctoral studies. Your previous credits will be restored, and we will even accept the foundational work you completed on the Ashford case as a significant practical component of your thesis. You deserve to finish what you started, Sophie." The offer was more than just a chance to finish her education. It was an acknowledgement of her true self, the self she had hidden beneath the blue cleaning uniform. Sophie accepted immediately. The transition back to academia was swift and profound. Where others might have struggled to re-engage with abstract mathematics, Sophie found profound comfort. The equations offered the clean, verifiable truth that the real world so often lacked. She poured her energy into her doctoral thesis, which she titled The Vulnerability Vector, utilizing asymmetry and information to deconstruct market monopolies. It was, in effect, the rigorous, theoretical explanation of how she had destroyed Thomas Ashford. She utilized her lived experience to prove that a small, highly analytical player could always find the single point of failure in an overly large, arrogant system. She defended the thesis in less than 1 year, earning her title, Dr. Sophie Bennett. Immediately, offers for consultancy flooded in. Financial institutions and legal firms desperate to understand the Bennett method offered fees ranging from £5,000 to £20,000 per day for her insight. Within 6 months, Sophie had earned hundreds of thousands of pounds. This money was not destined for a luxurious penthouse. It was earmarked for a single, defining purpose. She leased a modest office space in East London, far from the polished marble of the Wellington Club. On the door, a simple brass plaque read, "The Equity Project." The project was her lasting legacy. It was a free advisory service dedicated to helping ordinary people and small businesses fight against powerful, often corrupt corporate entities, the victims like her father, who were routinely dismissed and crushed by overwhelming legal and financial force. Oliver Price, the journalist who had become her ally, visited the office shortly after it opened. He found Sophie, now dressed in sharp, professional clothes, explaining complex land use laws to an elderly woman whose small shop was being threatened by a large development group. So, Dr. Bennett, Oliver said, leaning against the door frame as the elderly client left, beaming. From cleaning toilets to cleaning up London's financial district. How does it feel? Sophie smiled, a genuine, relaxed smile that had been absent for years. It feels like I finally found the right application for the math, Oliver. We are creating a system where the smallest number still has meaning. We make sure the rich and powerful are still subject to the laws of arithmetic. And Thomas Ashford? Oliver asked softly. Any news on the final judgment? Today, Sophie confirmed, glancing at the small, cheap clock on the wall. It was today. The trial had been swift and brutal. The evidence, the meticulous financial breakdown, the clear violation of environmental laws, and the chilling audio recording of the bribe was insurmountable. Thomas Ashford, once the master of his universe, looked small and gray as the judge read the verdict. He was found guilty on all counts of fraud, corruption, and environmental malfeasance. The sentence was 8 years in a maximum security prison. When the judge announced the time, Thomas finally broke. The sheer, overwhelming reality of 8 years trapped behind concrete walls, without his empire, without his pride, struck him silent. Justice, slow and methodical, had claimed its prize. A few days later, Sophie drove to a quiet cemetery outside the city. She carried a single bouquet of simple, white flowers, the kind her father, Richard Bennett, had always loved. She stood before his stone, the air cool and calm. The last time she had stood here, she was burning with a destructive, singular rage. Now, she felt a profound, heavy peace. She laid the flowers down gently. "It's over, Dad," she whispered, her voice catching slightly. "I didn't just get him. I dismantled everything he built on lies. The property group is gone. He is facing 8 years. The people he tried to hurt, they are safe now." She paused, taking a deep breath of the fresh air, the scent of cut grass and damp earth filling her lungs. "I never stopped being your daughter, and I never stopped fighting for what was right. You taught me that integrity is the only true wealth." Sophie did not linger. The grief was still there, a soft ache, but the consuming weight of vengeance was gone, replaced by purpose.
Dr.
Sophie Bennett returned to her small office. She had been offered positions in elite financial institutions, guaranteed millions in income. But she chose the equity project. She chose the fight for the vulnerable. She sat at her desk, turning on her simple laptop, ready to work on the next case, a small community facing eviction due to fraudulent paperwork. She was no longer hiding, no longer invisible. She was the one true architect of her own life, using logic and truth to build a world where arrogance and wealth did not automatically equate to power. The invisible mathematician had proven that the people we overlook might change absolutely everything. Now, we want to know your opinion. From 0 to 10, what score does this story deserve?